Okay, so OK Mountain is both a sort of art collective and a gallery space. So as a group, we do produce art objects, installations, prints, video, gallery museum projects, murals, drawings, commission public sculptures, and so on. But given the focus of this conference, it seemed important to note that all this type of making behavior and any of the success that has come out of that making behavior started with the opening of a series of tiny, no-profit spaces as opposed to non-profit or not-for-profit spaces that really just didn't even attempt to engage any kind of profit ideas, maybe through inability or whatever. But then these spaces obviously showcased mostly non-professional and I would say youngish artist types that were interested in presenting their ideas and work, but really had no relative venues or venues that made sense to them, but who were still interested in making things. And I think that's kind of something that is useful. Oh, right. Not to get confused. I have to do two. Wow. Okay. So from about 2003 to 2005, there were three, and this is going to be sort of like a historical narrative, which I'm really interested in as my practice goes on. I'm really interested in how there's 9 of us in this collective and how this narrative has been evolving over like many years and where we've put the focus depending on who the audience is and who I'm presenting with and so on. So I thought this little history might be interesting. And it is like a local geographic, I wouldn't say Austin, Texas is rural, but it certainly isn't an epicenter of sort of like art culture, mostly music culture, I think, and youth culture, really. So from about 2003 to 5, there were 3 spaces operating in Austin that sort of prefigured our gallery, and as both a gallery and as a collective. Camp Fig, which was mentioned earlier, was an Artist Studios and the Fresh Up Club. These 3 spaces. This is not to say that there's spaces like this that were kind of impromptu and off the cuff did not exist before these spaces for previous generations or in previous iterations, but this is just what I kind of grew up with and grew up knowing. One of the things I would be interested in hearing about is not just about unconventional spaces, but also about their lifespans in some ways, like how long are things supposed to continue for unconventional spaces versus their sort of established normative spaces that have like these long kind of histories. And also interested in like how to build on this kind of knowledge that is and experiences that kind of tend to fade or dissipate quickly from the present memory. So I'm talking about spaces from 2003, but really there's so many people in Austin that probably wouldn't know these places. This is kind of one of the things I'm interested in, like this idea of perpetuity and short-term strategic arrangements, like on a kind of how we group ourselves and the kind of places we decide are like our venues. So each of these different spaces I just mentioned served, I would say, a somewhat different but overlapping community that our gallery, OK Mountain, eventually sort of adopted in some way or came into dialogue with. But of course there were other spaces there too, so like Mass Gallery, which I think there's a couple people here from Mass today I see in the audience. So I want to just mention that there were other places too. So this is just one very weird narrative about how Austin kind of emerged, or how Austin's emerging as a sort of kind of art community. So at this time in this early 2000s with these 3 places, these spaces, most of the work exhibited was very playful, I would say kind of slightly uncritical even, and hyperly kind of visually, unapologetically sort of graphically orientated. In all honesty, I don't know if we really were that interested in these kind of huge ideas or like big burdensome concepts, but I think that I think the one thing that we definitely were interested in was this sort of like kind of exuberance and this sort of just like attempting to try to do something without being asked or without being given permission or without having any funding. The Artist Studios was another place that kind of had this similar vibe. They held openings, they threw elaborate parties that featured extremely convoluted build-outs. Everything was cheaply made. All these spaces were relatively roughly hewn, I would say generally overcrowded, somewhat smelly, totally non-funded, and just kind of energetic. These are places that sort of conflated like this sort of grumpy distinction between socializing, partying in some ways, art exhibiting, and like concert venues. So these places were very multi-functional, and a lot of times with all the functions happening at once. Look, I did that both of the. Okay, so the Fresh Up Club was like, of the three spaces, this was like the heady concept-driven space where lots of peculiar, somewhat highbrow, yet completely unpolished installations and group shows were taking place. There was a giant sewer grate in the middle of the space. Oftentimes the bands would just be playing in the middle of the exhibition, which I think that's kind of the spirit of what was going on, like kind of early 2000s in Austin, Texas. And the Blue Theater was, this is an outside shot of the Fresh Up Club, and you can kind of, does my mouse work? Yes. So you can see this is kind of the Fresh Up Club. The Blue Theater was well, they kind of offered a helping hand to the Fresh Up Club. They sort of offered them a space without charging them rent, which I think was really nice for a larger community, a larger institution to sort of house a smaller, more experimental institution within it. And I think this like ability of no rent really allowed the Fresh Up Club to have a kind of different kind of attitude towards their projects, totally uncommercial and completely experimental. So like around 2006, all these different spaces were running out of steam for one reason or another. And so we all combined our energy and efforts to make a new kind of project. We were relatively happy with the service we were providing to the community, which was basically just a kind of a ultimate social networking kind of service that revolved around like art and music. But we wanted to actually try to do something less of a mess, right? We started thinking that we weren't really interested in making an alternative so much as just making something for ourselves, right? So without trying to suggest some kind of total naivety on our parts, at this point in our minds, we were thinking we were making a proper gallery, right? One that wouldn't scare away collectors, right? One that curators would feel comfortable in. And by proper, I just really am talking about financially sustainable, right? Up until this point, we had all been paying out of our relatively de-skilled pockets, for rent, maintenance, shipping, hosting, and all the countless expenses that go into having an exhibition, all at the same time without engaging any kind of grant writing activities or really asking for anything, just basically sacrificing ourselves in some ways, throwing ourselves on this pyre, right? Financial ruin. I think I still owe the gallery like $1,000, which they will never get, right? So we were trying to be professional, right? So we wanted to send out press releases, and this, I should sort of explain some of these images. This is a build out of this new space, and you can see we put up drywall, so this was like a big thing, right? No more just brick walls with gigantic screws through them. And this is the backyard of this space that we developed, this OK Mountain space that we were developing. And like I said, we were really trying to be very professional, whatever that meant to us at the time. And this, one of the things it meant was releasing press releases, stuff like that, framing a drawing, making sure the floors were mopped. And so sometimes when I think about this time, I think about the Ramones, that punk band, the Ramones. Maybe some of you are familiar with them. They had this kind of sort of diluted sense of themselves. They thought they were really making this kind of high caliber rock pop product, like something along the lines of Beatles' Abbey Road or something like that. But it turns out they were just making punk, sort of unbeknownst to themselves. And I think that's kind of what we were thinking along those lines. We were like, certainly kind of like thinking, well, we're just going to try to be like the Gagosian of South Texas or something. I don't know. But luckily, we had lots of support from different community members. Mel Ziegler, who taught at the University of Texas, who maybe if you've taken a course on a conceptual art or something like that in America, you might have heard his name. Kate Erickson, too. He rented it. This was his old studio, so he rented to us somewhat cheaply on the condition that we help him build it out and that we donate our labor to him on other unnamed ventures. So we had no real contract with this man. He was sort of like a mentor. he would just email us and tell us things like, I'm tarring the roof, so we'll see you there. And we were obliged to kind of help him do these things. This is the exterior of OK Mountain 1.0, right? So despite this rather rough-looking exterior, we ended up with what I would imagine what we thought of as like a kind of clean, well-lit, kind of contemporary gallery space, which had its quirks, but overall I think it was relatively convincing. So our first show was Jason Villegas, a Houston-based artist, and I mentioned him because I was going to talk about a little bit about who we ended up showing eventually. So Jason Villegas, Houston-based, so Texas-based, and I also wanted to just mention that I curated that show, and I saw his work at another museum called the Mexicarte, which featured a series of shows every year called the Young Latino Artists kind of show. And so just to kind of like show how we weren't just on an island to ourselves, right? We were working with Mel Ziegler from University of Texas. I was trying to cull artists from museum shows. We also showed a national artist. So here's an exhibition by Jesse Greenberg and Ryan Tricarton, whose name may sound familiar, and some other sort of those cohorts from that RISD group that came up at that time. And this film right here is IB Area, which is showing right here, which was at the time, this was kind of like it was just being finished by Ryan Tricarton at this point. And it was quite something, I think, for us to be showing this kind of really radical film in our neck of the woods, right? So this would kind of exemplify sort of like our idea of a national exhibition, right? Some people from RISD. But we also showed international artists on occasion, but like not just independently without any help or on our own. This kind of activity usually meant us interacting with larger kind of institutions. Essentially, we had a relatively functional relationship with the University of Texas Blanton Museum of Art, the art house in Austin, and where we all were installation gurus, right? We all worked as preparators. And of course, we had relationships with the Austin Museum of Art. And this particular exhibition was curated by Regine while she was working at UT. So we did coordinate with other institutions, right? And oftentimes trying to turn what would be just simply a lecture into a exhibition as well. So coordinating with the museums to sort of expand their kind of programming and to sort of just to sort of kind of cross-pollinate a little bit, which is something else I'm kind of interested in, like this idea of how alternative and unconventional spaces work in tandem with more kind of substantial, right, quoting that, substantial institutions, and how, if that ever happens, and how and when these kinds of relationships are advantageous, or when are they symbiotic, when are they sort of unbalanced, right? Our resources were always at a minimum, so we cannibalized everything. I would encourage that for any young people out there. This was the trailer you see here, which was part of Basim Magdi's show that Regine curated, was something that we borrowed from somebody. We got all these wood chips free from Craigslist. You know, we foraged on a constant basis and just cannibalized whatever we could to make what we had work. And I wanted to show this one image of a show by Elaine Bradford because this would kind of typify the climatic point of our sort of idea of being a profit gallery. So basically we sold this sculpture, which was kind of astonishing to us. It was kind of like the only thing we ever sold, really. And it sort of like marked the rise and fall of our ambitions as a kind of profit space, right? It was our sole kind of moment. But we persevered regardless, you know. But beyond exhibitions, we held readings, performances, and music shows that were occasionally held in tandem with exhibitions. So we hosted musicians that were artists that made sound. And this way, I believe that we tried to like embrace this kind of back and forth between visual artists and musicians. And then despite all of our like kind of quirky sort of idiosyncratic behavior, we did participate in kind of larger structured events like the Texas Biennial, which is a semi-annual exhibition held at various locations, all over the state of Texas, featuring Texas artists. So I think we just kind of like we would just do whatever we wanted to do whenever we wanted to do it. If something seemed slightly advantageous or like it would be nice for us to do, we would do it. Sometimes we would service the community and say, yes, we'll host that night of things. Sometimes we would just be servicing ourselves in the sense that we would be like, I want this person to come in and do this show. So as far as like structures go, I believe that we probably are, I wish we had a nice diagram of a circle and a line, and we had nothing. It's just like a amoeba meeting several other amoebas. In 2008, we had an opportunity to do an exhibition which sort of solidified our kind of idea of being a sort of artist collective, which this was not our purpose for joining forces. Our purpose for joining forces was to bring kind of like sort of interesting programming and art programming and music programming to Austin. But I don't know, since we were all artists anyways, it just happened. Eventually, we just started making things together. And I think I'm just going to kind of zip through a few things. So eventually, we started getting on the sort of fair circuit. So this is Pulse Miami. And we began making things as a collective, which I think is sort of like the second kind of half of the sort of legacy, which is kind of interesting, but I'm kind of more interested actually in the first part, the sort of history and this sort of like the dynamism of these three spaces and how our space came out of that and how we interacted with other spaces at the time. But I think I'm going to maybe just let that go and be the end of it. Does that sound fair?
Sounds fair.
Okay.